Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by Affirm Press. Listeners, much of the joy in focusing this podcast series on Australian fiction has come from the opportunity to delve into Australia's past from a multitude of perspectives. Stories which have challenged what little I understood about our beginnings, our development, our environment, and coming of age, who we are and how we got here. Much of this learning I've absorbed through meticulously researched tales, lifting the veil on a mythologized or romanticized version of our past. Tales that interrogate the space between truth and fiction and where they coincide. I love these types of stories, and so when I learned about my next guest author's book, I knew I had to find out more. Pip Fioretti is a Sydney-based author who has been writing fiction since 2006 alongside a career in visual arts. In the 2021 Sydney lockdown and inspired by walks she'd taken through the arid rangelands of Western New South Wales, Pip wrote the first draft for a novel that would become her first crime novel, Bonelands. Released by Affirm Press at the end of March, Bonelands is a highly evocative, compelling and somewhat confronting novel which delves into Australia's dark past and prosperity built on the back of the pastoral industry. A thoroughly engrossing, sobering novel that heralds a bright future for one of Australia's newest outback noir writers. And to that end, I'm delighted to welcome Pip Fioretti to the podcast today. Hi, Pip.
Hi, great to be here.
Wonderful to have you. And congratulations once again on this brilliant novel.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm a bit overwhelmed by all the praise, but I'll take it. Thank you.
Now, I know I just spoke about walking in Western New South Wales as your inspiration, but I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more on how you came to be writing about Augustus Hawkins, a Boer War veteran in a town out in the dusty plains of the outback.
Well, Gus bobbed up in a manuscript about 6 or 7 years ago as a bit player. And I gave him a bit of a backstory. And I went on writing the manuscript, but I thought, I like that guy. He's interesting. But I put him away. And then I brought him out again, and I set a novel in 1913 in Sydney. And I brought him out for that. And then I thought, no, I really want to write his origin story, not as a soldier, but as someone who solves crimes. And how he gets into solving crimes is the story of Bonelands.
So for those who haven't read it yet, Pip, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the story.
Well, he's from an upper class background, and he, at age 18, full of all the ideals of imperial masculinity, of self-sacrifice and dying for your country, joins the Australian Light Horse, or what was then the Mounted Rifles, and goes to South Africa, and he fights in the Boer War, but becomes terribly disillusioned. We would call it moral injury by some of the atrocities he sees and his physical wounds, which both combine to deeply traumatize him in a time where post-traumatic stress was seen as moral weakness and malingering and lack of self-will, self-control, and absolutely soul-destroying for the men who developed PTSD, because they were expected to overcome it just through sheer force of manly willpower. Now, he was deeply traumatized by this imperial war, and then he comes back to Australia. He's very, very damaged still. He leaves his world behind, and he travels around New South Wales, brawling and drinking and fighting and just generally the fury of trauma. And then he decides he's got to get back on track. He joins the mounted troopers and takes a post out, a one-man post, right out in the bush on the banks of the Darling River, a place with a very small population. And he tries to contain his rage and himself within the straitjacket of the uniform. He gradually gets to know the people in his world. He polices diligently, he records everything diligently, and he makes friends with wealthy wool barons because they sense he comes from a background like them. Class was incredibly important in Australia in the early 1900s. And there he meets Flora, the daughter of one of the pastoralists, and falls in love with her. Now, in true Edwardian fashion, her father has other ideas. Daughters are for marrying off to other wealthy families in order to maintain one's fortune and one's property holdings. And they decide that they love each other and they want to run away, but tragedy strikes not long after. Flora's three siblings are brutally murdered, and Gus and Flora are parted. Flora is sent away, and Gus is suddenly confronted with two Sydney detectives and his own misdemeanors, and yet he is filled with the need to find who killed his friends, who killed Flora's siblings, and he pushes himself through the landscape, through the community to find some sort of justice. In many ways, he's looking for justice for himself, looking for justice for the people he saw wounded in South Africa. And he comes across other traumatized people in the story, people whose personal traumas have contributed to the situation. I don't want to give too much away about the plot. As a backdrop to this, I'm looking at the landscape and the practices at the time, which were quite rapacious in terms of exploiting the land for what it could give, with no thought to tomorrow. And the fact that these rangelands have not recovered, they simply have not recovered from being overstocked with sheep and the widespread killing of all native animals in an effort to improve the pastures. You see, these pastoralists got the leases on the proviso that they improve the land, and improving the land meant making it pay. So that meant killing a lot of what they called vermin, but at the same time battling introduced feral species that were also degrading the land. And then you've got the practices of brutalizing the animals that they were working with. Stock was seen as stock, not sentient creatures. And there was a lot of cruelty involved. And I wanted to look at how a system that is so cruel, what effect does that have on the humans who are working in it? It does brutalize and desensitize them. In a sense, it's sort of like traumatized imperial man lands on traumatized colonial landscape, and this is what happens.
I want to talk more about the sense of place that you evoke in this. But before we do that, I just kind of want to go back. The book, as you've mentioned, is set in 1911. Australia's only newly federated, and many men, as you say, are still suffering from the effects of their service in South Africa, fighting the Boer War for the British Empire. And the production of wool very much preoccupied much of Australian primary industries, being in high demand as an export. So I guess I wanted to know why then, what was it about this period that really drew you to want to explore it?
Well, I've been interested, my background is in visual art, and I really enjoy the art and novels and music from the period from, say, 1880 to 1920, sort of that modernist sensibility clashing with the old Victorian ways of doing things. It was a really fertile, tumultuous period. In those days, Australia was, miles away from anything, but things were changing. And I really like looking at paintings as a way of getting into an historical era. And so it just made sense to me to read about the era, to read novels of the era, to look at the paintings that were made in that era and also about that era. It really is, the last gasp of the long 19th century. And we know as readers what cataclysm is coming, but they don't know. They don't know World War I is coming, but they are living at the end of an awfully long period of stability. It's really on the cusp of a technological boom. You can see in the book that, with distances that we have in Australia, policing was really stretched. Everything had to be done by telegram. And that fascinates me too, how daily life went on under those conditions without all the comforts that we have. No electricity, no gas. People had simple tastes in food. Well, they had to because there just wasn't a massive variety around. Religion was, everybody had a religion. Yeah, it's just sometimes I like to see that past as somewhere I can go and be and dwell in and understand. And it helps me to understand my own time. I think most historical novels are about the time in which they're written, because there are concerns in the book that would not have been written about back then, but they are concerns that contemporary readers are interested in. And I like that. I like going back and seeing the hidden bits. What were the women doing? What were the poor people doing? What were the Indigenous people doing? That sort of texture, the texture of their daily lives.
Yeah, indeed. I absolutely loved it. Now, you spoke at length about Augustus, or Gus as you've called him. I think he's an incredibly fascinating character. Not only is he a veteran bearing physical and mental scars, but he's also incredibly scathing of Australia's role in that war, and also of Australia's complicity in the Empire's actions there. And he's
Mm,
morally flawed himself, I think. But when we
mm.
meet him, he's
As
deep in the
are we all.
trenches. Yes, indeed, indeed, as are we all. It's no criticism. But when we meet him, he's deep in the trenches of self pity and loathing, a legacy of his combined experiences to that time. But he was also tough, and he brooked no nonsense from the townspeople. And you mentioned his upbringing. He came from the upper classes himself. His father was a doctor. He had attended university, but the townspeople viewed him as a green skin. Can you tell me more about this and why it was important to his relations with the people of Kalpa and neighbouring towns?
Yeah, a greenskin is the son of a rich man who will always have things easy no matter what. In a sense, that's right. And it was right then, and it's still right now. And Gus always has his home on the East Coast to go back to if he can bear it. Back then, there was just one dominant narrative. Back then, there was king, God, and country, or God, king, and country, and everybody ascribed to that. What happens when you've been so traumatized you can't believe in it anymore? I mean, his world has just been destroyed. There are some scenes I left out of him reading a lot of the imperial novels that he would have read, a lot of the Boy's Own Adventures and King Solomon's Mines and all that sort of stuff, and how wonderful the empire is. And he realizes, hey, it's actually not. It's actually a brutal, rapacious machine. And I've believed this all in my life. I went and fought for it. And look at me now. This is what I saw them do, and this is what happened to me. And I am angry. And in a sense, his veteran's journey is very similar to men who fought in the Vietnam War. It was not a just war. Who fought in Iraq or Iran for political adventuring rather than a just war like World War One or World War Two. The British were basically in South Africa because they wanted the gold and diamonds. That's what they wanted, and that's the way an empire works. Yeah, he was just crushed by the fact that they were actually like that, because they're terribly young, these, soldiers when they go off. But I also wanted a man who could access all areas. I needed him to be able to pull himself together, shine his boots, and go into the drawing rooms of the upper classes, because that's where I needed to go to write the story. Yeah, and also his going off and going bush and drinking and carousing would be seen as letting the side down by his family back east. It's mortifying for his father to have his only child gone feral. So there's a lot of conflicts, inner conflicts, external conflicts that he's having to manage. And a character with a lot of conflicts is a juicy character, is something you can really get into as a writer.
And so, I mean, to that end, it would be interesting for listeners to understand that you wrote this novel completely from Gus's point of view.
I did think of writing it from his point of view and one other character, Sally Gilmore, but I kept saying to myself, whose story is this? Pull back, stay on the path. The working title was A Soldier of the Queen. Now, that is the title of a song that all the soldiers from the Boer War sang. And he had sworn allegiance to Queen Victoria, and this is the song they sang on the boats or when they were marching, whatever. That was like my pole star. This is his story. This is his story. Soldier of the Queen. Stay there. Don't deviate. And I tried writing it in third person, and it didn't have the immediacy. So I switched back to first person, and it felt right.
It was so interesting to get inside Gus's head, not just to see everything from his point of view, but also to understand his limitations about what he could see
Yeah.
and what he could hear and what he could investigate and what he couldn't investigate. You managed to give us a really strong sense of place through Gus's eyes, and you evoke so well the taste of the dust. We feel the dry, deadly heat. We smell the smells. We see the sights. We hear the incessant buzzing of insects, and we see the marauding predators. And the landscape, as you've also alluded to, is as much a character as any of the others in this story. And Pip, as with many outback noir novels that have captured Australian readers' attention in the last few years, and indeed global audiences as well, this sense of place has been crucial. So was that something that you were aware of and conscious of doing well when you were writing, or was this more instinct?
Partly conscious, partly instinct. I love world building. I could build worlds in my manuscripts quite happily for days on end. So it's partly for my own pleasure. I've often had to pull back and sort of, take stuff out. But I like to evoke atmosphere. I sit down at the screen and I see it in my head, and it's like I've got some sort of goggles on and I see what Gus would see. I have to sort of put that in to give atmosphere and give that sense of place. So that takes the reader in there too. I take them with me into that land. So, I think wherever I set a book, the surroundings are really important to me.
You spoke a little bit about the fact that you were drawn to paintings and novels of the time. Was there any additional research you needed to do to bring this landscape
Oh,
alive on the
heavens,
page?
yes.
Mm.
Yes, the paintings and the novels are the flavour. They're the spice packet you sort of sprinkle over the noodles, if you like. You've got to really do the hard yards of getting your facts and figures. And then you've got to resist jamming it all in there because you find it interesting. You've got to prioritise the story. But I've done a lot of reading about the Boer War, about wool production and wool in the Australian mythology, the ethos of the male private schools of the time, the whole notion of self-sacrifice and duty and honour and virtue and all the words that we just shrug off now as sort of slightly odd relics from the past. I think they still do have a place, but that's for another discussion. Yeah, I had to find out about agricultural practices, about did they have electricity or did they not? I had a fantastic pointer from a curator at the Justice Museum. She pointed me in the direction of the annual reports of the New South Wales Police Department from 1911. And what a little gem that was. I could go through and I could see which stations had mounted troopers, which division they were all in, what the main crimes were at the time, how they functioned. That sort of thing is priceless. And I also did a lot of reading I'm hugely influenced by Don Watson's book, The Bush, in terms of attitude towards the land in Australia. Kate Holden's book, The Winter Road, about a broadacre farmer and an environmental activist and, the terrible tragedy that happened when these two ideologies clash. Several books about the Darling and the water situation there, how we've monetized this crucial resource and now it's the plaything of the markets, and how that is actually damaging the river. It's not just chemical runoff, there's a whole lot more to it. So it was wide-ranging research, but always pleasurable.
Pip, misogyny was rife in the world that you've depicted in the pages of this novel. There is no doubt this was a man's world. Women were objects, and Gus himself, while not an explicitly cruel man in any way, is himself guilty of using some of the women who had the misfortune to cross his path without really any thought about how this affected the women concerned. There was quite a lot of entitlement in the book. Yeah.
Yes. Well, that's the way it was. I mean, the way we live now is not the way it's always been. And sometimes I think younger people don't realise that. What older feminists fought for, they are enjoying the fruits of it. Back then, yes, men ruled the world. I mean, Australia was called a working man's paradise, and it was. But the male population outnumbered the women's population, and 50% of the population lived in rural Australia. Now, women had babies without contraception, without access to electricity, the amount of manual labor they had to do was extraordinary. They died like flies. Their children died. There was very little. The age pension only come in, I think, about 1908. It was really tough, particularly for working girls, and equally tough for wealthy women because they were not allowed to step out of their role as wives and mothers. Men took what they wanted and discarded the rest. They've always been doing that since, the year dot, and they will always continue to do that. I could not make Gus a 21st century man. He was a man of his time. And wealthy men had access to laundry maids, to children, and syphilis was rampant. So they had to really pick and choose who they bedded. And there's stories of the British men, upper class men, going to the opera in London and coming out and picking one of the young girls outside waiting for them to take home, or go to a hotel or whatever, and they'd shag them and then just go on their way. And it surprises me that people are surprised, because that ability to compartmentalize and put a wealthy woman on a pedestal of she's too beautiful and pure, and then over there you have the working class woman who's just there for your sexual gratification. This is how it was. This is how it is. It's a deeply ingrained masculine entitlement that is facilitated by their ability to compartmentalize what I do in this situation and what I do in that situation, and still call themselves a good man.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was so much nuance in this novel. As you said, you've been able to portray not only the situation of wealthy woman protected by the wealth of her family, but also the working class women, the Black women, the Indigenous women. You've really covered a lot of ground in trying to expose treatment of women in this time.
Yeah,
So,
it's a bit like watching Mad Men and seeing, in the first series how badly the women were treated, and everyone smoked and drank. And hey, this was just the way they rolled. And you look at it and you go, oh my God, was it really like that? Well, yeah, it was. It's just really important to remind ourselves that we cannot let our guard down in terms of fighting for respect and fighting to bring down misogyny. Gus, he's a man of his time, and yeah, he's entitled, but he's also got a bit of a soul. And I don't know that he's happy about seeing what he sees. Who would be? But this is what cops today see all the time. They see that they come in after the event and mop up the results of misogyny and brutality and patriarchy, and it gets to them.
yeah, indeed it does. And so true. We are fighting this same battle even today.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We're fighting against a dominant class that is taking all the resources for themselves, as in properties. Properties are now financialized as investment, and those lower down the pyramid are not getting a look in. Back then, the land was enclosed and the rich man had it all to himself, and the poor people were given a bit of mutton as payment for guarding his land. It is still the same. That's why I included the quote from Thomas More at the front of the book, when he's talking about how during the reign of Henry VIII, the common land was enclosed and poor people were pushed out. The common land was enclosed by the rich people to put their sheep there. And these poor people were pushed into the cities. And from the cities, they were still poor. They had to commit the odd crime here and there to survive. Next minute, they're on a convict ship bound for Australia. And here we are. It is a long, unbreakable thread from then to now. And we are still doing it in terms of privatising everything. So those at the top of the pyramid benefit and those at the bottom of the pyramid don't. So we are still very close to those days.
Pip, this was such an intricately plotted novel, and there was more than one crime in the novel, in fact. How do you do this? And are you a plotter or a pantser?
I'm a pantser. I just bumble along and bang my head against the wall, continuously for a long time until I get a solution. And then I couldn't plot in advance because I would get bored. I write to find out what happens. Not knowing keeps my interest up. And so I like to sort of I mean, I've got a vague idea, but I do not want to solidify that idea when I start, because I don't want to lose that flexibility and ability to say, that's not working, chuck it out. Got to realize when you simply cannot make that plot work, you have to pull something in from somewhere else. I think tightening up and plotting too much to start with just doesn't work for me. I know it does for some writers, but not for me.
So interesting. So, Pip, tell me about the title Bonelands and what it signifies to readers, because as you mentioned earlier, it wasn't the original title for this work.
No, it wasn't. But Affirm said, we're not going to go with that title. Have you got any others in your kit bag? I thought about the landscape and how, I do a lot of bushwalking and hiking, and sometimes you walk in arid areas of Australia and there's bones everywhere, like the northern Flinders Ranges. You go up there after the year before there's been a lot of rain, so the goat populations skyrocket, and then there's drought, and there's just dead goats and bones everywhere. And it's a bit confronting for a city person to see that sort of stuff. But, there are places called Dead Goat Soak, it's a reality. And this district that I'm writing about is coming out of the Federation drought, which was a monster of a drought. I mean, really full on. And because so much of the population was rural, people still see this thing as the mother of all droughts. That landscape was just littered with things that had died. People, Indigenous people, white people, stock, birds, wildlife. And no one's going to clean all that away. So there are just bones everywhere. So it is the Bonelands. That was the title. How I came to the title.
Yeah, I love it. Pip, I feel like, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like you've left the door open for Gus to return to pursue something he lost in this novel. Any thoughts of a sequel?
Oh, yes. I don't think I'm finished with him. I don't think he's run his course. And while I feel that, and while I enjoy writing him, I will. But if I suddenly go, Gus, it's time for you to live your own life. I'm going somewhere else. Then you let go. I'd like to bring him into calmer waters, of course I would, but, not yet. I'm not done with him. That's what they say, put your character up a tree, throw rocks at them and set fire to the tree when they try to come down. I'm not, I'm not finished with him. The wheels are still spinning with Gus. It's still like, well, what happens next? What does he do next? How's he going to resolve this? And how's he going to resolve that? And while I'm still asking those questions of myself and of him and of the time in particular, there's still, petrol in the engine, so to speak.
So, Pip, you had a few women's fiction titles published, titles that included The Book of Love and The Fragment of Dreams, books, incidentally, that were published under the name of Philippa Fioretti. So I wanted to ask you,
That's correct.
Why the switch? Why, and what led you to this point in your writing journey?
Those books, which I'm very fond of, were written at a different place in my life. And while I really enjoyed writing them, and I learned so much from the experience, I wanted to try something different. I've always felt that I have a non-fiction book inside me, but it may well stay inside me because I cannot find anything that would sustain the drive needed to push through. But when I started, and it was historical women's fiction that Gus turns up in, he bobs up and I thought, yeah, that's calling to me. He's calling to me. There's a little voice from the hard drive going, Philippa, write about me. You want to. And I think you have to go where the heat is, in a sense. If my mind is saying, you really do want to write about him, then have a go. See if you can do it. See if you can write from a man's perspective. See what you get from it. See if it works. And I think I always want to challenge myself. I don't want to settle into a sort of churn out women's fiction every couple of years. there's a place for them and everything, but I'm just at a different place in my life where I want to push myself.
You have been a writer for some time, as we've already alluded to. So for those writers out there who are looking to get published, I wondered if you had any tips to offer them.
Any tips to get published? Spin the wheel of fortune. Because it is a horse race, and you just don't know. Both times I've been picked up for publication have been when I have entered my manuscript in a manuscript development program. The first time I was in the first Hachette Queensland Writers Centre manuscript development program, where, get this was back in the day, they flew 8 of us up to Bribie Island for 5 days, where we worked with a publisher, a writer, and another agent. And we worked on we had a lot of workshops and stuff. And then, after that, they offered me I made the changes they suggested, and they offered me a 2-book contract. You imagine being flown somewhere for 5 days, all expenses paid. These days, it's just not going to happen. And then this book, I was still polishing when I saw an ad for an Affirm Varuna crime writing mentorship. And I thought, I'll have a go at that. So I put it in, and they got back in touch and said, look, you're not going to get a mentorship, but we'd like to talk about possibly publishing it. So that's how that happened. So I never had to submit it to anyone. I just got lucky. And there's an awful lot of luck involved in this game. Those sorts of competitions and programs are well worth keeping an eye on. And before they offered me the contract, I also prepared myself to do the Australian Society of Authors speed dating. So I had done all the preparation. I'd got my strap line and my pitch and I got all of that ready, and I was booked in and I was ready to go. And then I got the offer. So I pulled out. But I would really recommend that to anyone who's trying to sell a novel, is to do their online course in how to think about your book as a product to sell, how to write a synopsis, and how to give publishers and agents what they want to hear, not what you want to tell them, but what they want to hear. Yeah, do that and have a go at the speed dating.
Thank you so much for sharing such great tips. I had no idea that you struck gold twice.
Yeah, yes. Fate is very odd, isn't it?
Pip, I wanted to say that I've thoroughly enjoyed getting to sample your work through this excellent novel, Bonelands. I wish you every success with it and want to thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Claudine. It's always a pleasure to talk books and writing, and I've enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.